"I'd like someone to check her apron," the man said. "Before this goes any further." The whole diner went silent. Josie Merritt reached into her front pocket, expecting nothing. Her fingers closed around something cold and metal. She pulled it out slowly, a gold fountain pen gleaming under the fluorescent lights, worth more than she made in a year. "That's not possible," she whispered. "I didn't put that there. I swear to you, I didn't." 19 years old. Nursing student, nobody in that room stood up for her. Within 1 hour, she had lost her job. Within 1 day, she would face criminal charges. But nobody in that diner knew the truth yet. The quiet old man in the frayed gray coat, the one she had shown kindness to for weeks, the one who tipped $5 and apologized for it, was about to change everything. And he was not who they thought he was. Maple Creek, Ohio was not a big town. It was the kind of place where everybody knew your name, and usually your business too, whether you wanted them to or not. One traffic light downtown, one grocery store, one diner that had stood on Main Street since 1962. That diner was called the Copper Spoon. On a cold Tuesday morning in March, it was already full. Steam rose off the griddle. Coffee pots clinked against thick ceramic mugs. Bacon sizzled in the back, and the whole place smelled like it. Behind the counter, a 19-year-old girl moved fast. Her name was Josie Merritt, light brown hair, pulled back in a low ponytail. Flour dust sometimes clung to her apron, even though she never baked, old habit from her mother's kitchen. Josie was in her first year of nursing school. The community college sat 20 minutes away. She worked mornings at the diner before class. Some nights she worked there too. She did not complain. Not out loud, anyway. Her schedule looked something like this. Alarm at 4:45. At the diner by 5:30. Breakfast rush until 9. Then a quick change in the back room, and off to class. Most days she survived on coffee, and whatever toast never made it out to a table in time. The regulars had grown fond of her. She knew their orders before they even sat down. She knew who liked to talk, and who just wanted their coffee poured in silence. An older woman named Peggy Sue sat by the window most mornings. She worked the same crossword puzzle for weeks at a time. She refused to look up the answers, no matter how long a clue stumped her. A retired mail carrier named Jean Talbot argued with another regular about the weather, nearly every single morning. Neither of them ever seemed to win, and neither of them ever seemed to mind losing. It was that kind of place. Slow, familiar. The kind of town where a stranger stood out the moment he walked in. Near the back corner sat a man named Walter Kavanagh. He came in every morning at the same hour. Same order every time. 2 eggs over easy. Wheat toast, black coffee, no sugar. Walter had spent 31 years as the police chief of Maple Creek. He retired almost a decade ago. His back was a little stooped now, and his knees complained on cold mornings. But his eyes stayed sharp. He noticed things other people missed. It was a habit that had outlasted his badge by many years. "Morning, Josie," he said, as she passed with a coffee pot. "Morning, Chief," she said, out of habit more than accuracy. The town never stopped calling him that. "Busy one today," Walter said, glancing around the crowded diner. "Aren't they all?" Josie replied, refilling his cup without being asked. Walter watched her move through the room, the way he used to watch a crowd, always looking a little past the surface of things. A habit from a different life. One he had never quite managed to set down, not even after so many years without a badge. Her father, Daniel Merritt, had passed away 12 years earlier. He worked at the Whitfield steel plant just outside of town. There had been a fire. Josie barely remembered him, but she remembered the stories. People still spoke of Daniel Merritt with respect. He was the kind of man who stayed behind to help others. That was the story anyway. Nobody ever gave her the full details. Her mother, Vivian, raised her alone after that. She worked as a seamstress out of their small house on Willow Street. Steady hands, even when the bills were not. Lately, though, something had changed. Vivian's eyes had started to blur at the edges. She said it was nothing. Just tired eyes, she told Josie. Just getting older. Josie did not believe her, but she let it go for now. At 6:15 that morning, the bell above the diner door rang for the 40th time. Josie balanced 4 plates on one arm. She set them down without spilling a drop. Bacon, eggs, hash browns, toast. 3 tables at once. "Order up, sweetheart," called Roy Holt from the kitchen window. Roy owned the Copper Spoon. 18 years now, ever since his father passed the deed down to him. Roy was not a cruel man, but he was a tired one. He worried about money more than he worried about people. He never said that plainly, but everybody who worked for him knew it was true. That morning, before the rush hit full stride, Roy had spent 10 quiet minutes at his desk, sorting through the mail in the back office. Most of it he tossed aside without a second glance. An envelope, though, he set apart from the rest, unopened. He tucked it beneath a stack of invoices where he would not have to look at it again until later. He did not mention it to anyone. He simply went back out front, tied his apron tighter, and got to work. "Table 6 needs coffee," Josie called back, already moving. The regulars filled most of the booths that morning. Farmers in canvas jackets. A few retired schoolteachers, always in at the same time. 2 men from the hardware store, arguing about football like they did every Tuesday. It was a normal morning, until the door opened one more time. An old man stepped inside. He wore a gray coat that had seen better decades. The collar was frayed. One of the buttons was missing, replaced with a mismatched one that did not quite fit. His shoes were scuffed at the toes. His hands, when he pulled off worn gloves, looked rough and cracked from the cold. He was tall, but he stooped a little, like a man carrying something heavy nobody else could see. He looked to be in his 70s, maybe older. His hair was thin and white, combed back neatly despite everything else about him looking worn. He stood near the entrance for a moment. Just looking around, nobody greeted him. A few heads turned. A woman near the window whispered something to her husband. He chuckled under his breath. The old man found an empty stool at the counter and sat down slowly. He folded his hands in front of him and waited. Josie noticed him from across the room. She always noticed the quiet ones. Her father used to say something about that, according to her mother. Pay attention to the people nobody else looks at. She started toward him, but someone else moved faster. A young man in an expensive coat brushed past the old stranger on his way to the register. His shoulder clipped the old man's arm, hard enough to make him wince. "Watch it," the young man muttered. He did not even glance back. The old man said nothing. He simply steadied himself against the counter. A moment later, a waitress named Denise walked by carrying a fresh pot of coffee. She had worked there longer than Josie had been alive. She was moving fast, weaving between tables. She did not see the old man's cup was empty. Or maybe she did. Maybe she decided he was not worth the extra trip. Either way, she passed him without a word. There is a strange kind of invisibility that comes with growing older in this country. Fewer people meet your eyes on the street. Fewer people hold the door a beat longer. Fewer people ask how your week has been and actually wait for the answer. It happens slowly enough that most folks barely notice, until one day they are the ones sitting at the counter, waiting for a coffee refill that never comes. The old man in the gray coat had learned to expect it by now. He did not raise his hand. He did not ask twice. He simply waited, the way he had learned to wait for most things in life. Then it happened. A man at the next table was laughing loudly at something on his phone. He gestured too wide with his hand. His coffee cup tipped over. Hot liquid splashed across the counter, and some of it landed on the old man's sleeve. "Oh, sorry, old-timer," the man said. He did not sound sorry at all. A couple of people near him laughed. Nobody offered to help. Nobody handed him a napkin. One woman glanced over, then looked back down at her phone. The way people do when a stranger's discomfort is not their problem. A young man 2 stools down leaned toward his friend. He said something under his breath. His friend laughed. Neither of them lowered their voice enough to keep it private. The old man heard every word. His face did not change. He simply reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a handkerchief. Plain white, worn soft from years of washing. He dabbed at his sleeve without a word. Roy Holt saw the whole thing from the kitchen window. He frowned, but not out of sympathy. He walked out from behind the counter and approached the old man directly. "Can I help you with something?" Roy asked. There was an edge in his voice that had nothing to do with hospitality. "Just a cup of coffee, please," the old man said. His voice was low and even. "And maybe a look at the menu, if you have a moment." Roy hesitated. He glanced toward the young man near the register, the one still waiting on something. That man was from one of the big offices in the city, or so Roy thought. The kind of customer who left generous tips and sometimes brought business associates in for lunch. Roy lowered his voice. "Look," he said to the old man, "this is a busy morning. Maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere quieter." It was not phrased as a question. Everyone at the counter understood exactly what Roy meant. The old man's eyes did not flicker with anger. If anything, they looked almost amused, like he had heard this sentence before, more times than he could count. "I understand," the old man said quietly. He began to rise from the stool. That was when Josie stepped in. "Actually," she said, walking over with a fresh pot of coffee, "I've got a table open right here." She pointed to a booth near the window. Small, clean, tucked into the corner. A clear view of the street outside. Roy shot her a look. She ignored it. "Right this way, sir," Josie said, offering the old man a small, genuine smile. The old man studied her for a moment. Something in his expression shifted, just slightly, like he was recalculating something. "Thank you," he said simply. He followed her to the booth and sat down carefully, the way older people sometimes do when their knees have opinions about it. Josie poured him a fresh cup of coffee, filled it all the way to the top, the way regulars liked it. "Cream or sugar?" she asked. "Just black, thank you." He wrapped both hands around the mug, letting the warmth settle into his fingers. She handed him a menu. "Take your time," she said. "No rush at all." She turned to walk away. The old man spoke again. "What's your name?" She paused. "Josie." "Josie," he repeated, like he was filing it away somewhere important. "Thank you, Josie." She smiled again and went back to work. Roy caught her by the elbow near the kitchen pass. "You know that table's usually reserved for regulars around this time," he said under his breath. "It's empty, Roy. That's not the point." Josie crossed her arms. "Then what is the point?" Roy rubbed a hand over his face. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the breakfast rush. "The point is," he said, lowering his voice further, "I've got a loan payment due at the end of the month, so you need every table full of people who tip well." "I get it." Josie softened slightly. She knew about the loan. In the vague way people in a small town know things. Nobody had ever told her outright. Roy had never explained the details, and she had never asked. But the worry on his face had become a familiar fixture over the past year. The same way a crack in a window becomes part of the view. "He's not hurting anybody, Roy," she said gently. "He just wants breakfast." "I know that," Roy said. "I'm not a monster, Josie. I'm just trying to keep the lights on." "So am I," Josie said quietly. "That's kind of the whole point of being kind to people, especially when things are tight." Roy did not have an answer for that. He walked back toward the kitchen without another word. His jaw stayed tight for the rest of the morning. The old man ordered simply 2 eggs toast, a small side of fruit if they had it. Nothing extravagant. He ate slowly, pausing often, looking out the window at the gray Ohio morning. Josie checked on him twice, refilling his coffee without being asked. At one point, she noticed his hands trembling slightly as he lifted the mug. Not from age exactly, more like exhaustion, the kind that builds up in a person over a very long road. "Rough morning?" she asked gently, setting down the coffee pot. He looked up, surprised by the question. "Rough few years, if I'm honest," he said. She did not push further. She simply nodded, like she understood that some things did not need explaining right away. "Well," she said, "the eggs here are pretty good at least. Small comforts." A faint smile crossed his face, the first real smile he had shown since walking in. "Small comforts," he repeated. "I think I forgot those existed for a while." "Everybody forgets sometimes," Josie said. "That's what my mom always tells me. Life gets loud, and the small stuff gets drowned out." "Your mother sounds wise." "She's had a lot of practice," Josie said. "Just her and me for a long time now." The old man studied her for a moment. Something thoughtful crossed his face. "That's not an easy road," he said. "Raising a family alone?" "No," Josie agreed. "But she never let it show. Not to me, anyway." "Sounds like you learned that from her. Not letting the hard things show." Josie shrugged, a little embarrassed by how much she was sharing with a stranger. "I should get back to work," she said, smiling. "But it was nice talking with you." "Likewise, Josie," he said. "More than you know." She moved on to her next table. But something about that exchange stayed with her. She could not say exactly why. Around 8 that morning, the breakfast rush began to slow. Most of the regulars had cleared out. The diner grew quieter, filled with the low hum of conversation and the clink of silverware. The old man finally waved Josie over, a folded bill already in his hand. "I think I'm ready," he said. She brought the check, $8.40, plus tax. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket, and pulled out a worn leather wallet, only a few bills inside. He counted them slowly, carefully. His fingers moved over each one the way a man counts money when every dollar already has a purpose. It was a habit that had nothing to do with wealth, everything to do with a lifetime of watching people struggle. He placed enough to cover the meal on the table. Then, after a pause, he added a single $5 bill on top. "I wish it could be more," he said. There was real weight behind those words. "I know that's not much of a tip these days." Josie glanced at the money, then back at him. There was no judgment in her eyes, no disappointment, just calm, steady warmth. "You don't owe me an apology, sir," she said gently. "I'm just glad the food kept you warm this morning. Not everyone can spare more, and that's all right by me." The old man went very still. He simply looked at her, like he was trying to understand something that did not fit into what he already knew about the world. "You mean that?" he said quietly. "Not a question. Of course I mean it," Josie said, a little confused by how seriously he was taking such a small thing. "It's just breakfast." But it was not just breakfast to him, not by a long shot. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a small, worn notebook, leather-bound, the pages soft from handling. He opened it, clicked a pen, and wrote a single line. Josie could not see what he wrote. She was already turning toward another table. He closed the notebook and slipped it back into his coat. "Thank you, Josie," he said again, standing slowly. "I mean that more than you know." "You're welcome," she said, smiling. "Come back anytime. We'll save you the corner booth." He gave a small nod. Then he made his way toward the door, moving between the tables. As he passed Walter's booth, the old man paused for half a second, just long enough to nod at the folded newspaper. Walter nodded back, the way two old dogs sometimes size each other up without a single bark. Neither man said a word. But something passed between them anyway. Near the register, the young man in the expensive coat was still there, tapping something into his phone. He barely glanced up as the old man passed. Roy watched from behind the counter, arms crossed. He did not say anything as the old man left, but his eyes followed him out the door, a slight frown still on his face. Outside, the cold March air hit hard. The old man pulled his thin coat tighter and started down the sidewalk. He had not gone far when a black sedan pulled up along the curb, sleek, polished, out of place on a street lined with pickup trucks and old sedans. The driver's door opened. A man in a dark suit stepped out quickly and rounded the car. "Mr. Whitfield," the driver said, opening the back door. "You were gone longer than expected. Everything all right?" The old man paused before getting in. "Everything is fine, Charles," he said. "Better than fine, actually." He glanced back once toward the diner window. Through the glass, he could see Josie moving between tables, clearing plates, laughing at something one of the older customers said. Then he stepped into the car, and the door closed behind him. The sedan pulled away and disappeared down Main Street, heading toward the highway that led out of Maple Creek. Inside the Copper Spoon, nobody noticed the car. Nobody noticed the name Charles had used. Nobody watching that morning would have guessed the truth, that the man in the frayed gray coat was not simply an old man down on his luck. His name was Arthur Whitfield, and he was one of the wealthiest men in the entire state of Ohio. 2 hours away, in a glass tower in downtown Columbus, a very different morning was unfolding. The Whitfield Holdings building rose 32 stories above the city, all marble and steel in the lobby. The kind of place built to make visitors feel small the moment they walked in. On the 28th floor sat an office with floor-to-ceiling windows. A man named Holden Whitfield sat behind a large glass desk. Holden was 34. He had his grandfather's sharp jaw and his grandmother's pale blue eyes. Very little of Arthur's patience had made its way down to him. He wore a tailored navy suit, the kind that cost more than most people in Maple Creek made in a month. His watch alone cost more than Josie's mother's car. Across from him sat a woman in her early 60s, silver hair cut short and professional, sharp eyes behind thin reading glasses. Her name was Eleanor Grant. She had served as Arthur Whitfield's personal attorney for over 30 years. "I need this finalized by Friday," Holden said, sliding a thick folder across the desk. "The board is getting nervous. My grandfather's health isn't getting any younger." Eleanor did not touch the folder. "Your grandfather's health," she said evenly, "is not something you or I are qualified to assess. He had a cardiac scare weeks ago, Eleanor. You were there. You saw the hospital report." I saw a man recovering well under his doctor's care, Eleanor replied. Not a man who has lost the capacity to manage his own estate. Holden's jaw tightened. I'm not asking you to declare him incompetent, he said, his voice sharpening. I'm asking you to update the succession documents. That's it. That's your job. My job, Eleanor said calmly, is to represent Arthur's wishes, not yours. Holden stood and walked toward the window, looking out over the skyline. Do you know what happens to this company if something happens to him first, he asked. Chaos, lawsuits, the board fighting over every asset for years. That sounds like a reason to be patient, Eleanor said. Not a reason to rush. Patient, Holden repeated, almost laughing. Do you know how long I've been patient? I started here at 22. I've given this place 12 years. Nobody is questioning your work ethic, Holden. Then what are they questioning? Eleanor met his eyes steadily. I think you know the answer to that, she said. Holden's face flushed slightly, but he composed himself. Then perhaps, Eleanor said, you should ask your grandfather what he wants, instead of asking me to write it for him. Holden turned back to face her. He's been disappearing for weeks, he said. Nobody knows where he goes. Charles won't tell me. You won't tell me. I'm his only living family, Eleanor. And I'm kept in the dark. There was something underneath his frustration that sounded almost like fear. Eleanor studied him for a long moment. Your grandfather is a grown man, she said finally. He's allowed to take a drive without reporting it to the board. A drive, Holden repeated, unconvinced. For 6 hours at a time. Multiple times a week. That's not a drive, Eleanor. That's something else. Eleanor gathered her papers and stood. When Arthur is ready to discuss changes to his estate, she said, he will discuss them with me directly. Until then, I have nothing further to add. She walked toward the door, then paused. And Holden, she added, I'd be careful how loudly you discuss inheritance. Your grandfather is still very much alive. It leaves the wrong impression. She left the office without waiting for a response. Holden stood alone by the window for a long time, staring down at the traffic crawling along the street below. His parents had died in a car accident when he was 11. Arthur raised him after that. In this same city, in that same stone house on the outskirts of town, there had been tutors, boarding schools, summer internships arranged years in advance. There had never been much room or anything soft in that upbringing. Arthur taught him how to read a balance sheet before he taught him how to grieve. Holden told himself, most days, that he only wanted what was fair. He had spent his whole life inside these walls, learning this business from the ground up exactly the way his grandfather once asked him to. Somewhere underneath the frustration, buried deep enough that he rarely looked at it, there was still a boy, one who simply wanted to matter to the one relative he had left. He straightened his jacket and picked up his phone. He dialed a number he had been saving for exactly this kind of afternoon. I need you to look into someone, he said, once the call connected. Quietly, a waitress, Maple Creek, Ohio. That evening, Arthur Whitfield sat in the study of his large stone house on the outskirts of Columbus. A fire crackled in the hearth. Bookshelves lined every wall. Decades of ledgers, biographies, and worn paperback novels he never found the time to finish. Eleanor sat across from him in a leather armchair. A glass of untouched sherry rested on the table beside her. Another one today, Arthur said. More to himself than to her. How did it go? Eleanor asked. Arthur reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the small leather notebook. He opened it to the most recent page and slid it across the table. Eleanor picked it up and read the single line written there. Josie, the Copper Spoon Diner, Maple Creek, kind without condition. She looked up at him. That's it? That's all you wrote? That's all that needed writing, Arthur said. He leaned back, his eyes distant. You should have seen her face, Eleanor. She wasn't performing kindness. She wasn't trying to earn anything from me. She simply meant it. You say that about most of them, Eleanor said gently, and then something disqualifies them within the week. Arthur was quiet for a moment. This one felt different, he said finally. He set the notebook down on the table and stared at it, as though the 6 previous entries were still visible somewhere underneath the newest one. Do you remember the diner in Marietta? He asked. The waiter who counted my change to the penny, who told a customer to keep his voice down when he started yelling at the cook. I remember, Eleanor said. He lasted 11 days. Before you learned he'd been skimming tips from the other staff. And the young woman in Zanesville. Sweetest smile you ever saw. right up until she told a homeless man to move along from the bench outside her shop. Thinking I wasn't watching. I remember that one too. 7 towns, Eleanor. 7 people who looked kind on the surface. Every single time, something underneath didn't hold up once I looked closer. Arthur rubbed his eyes, suddenly looking every one of his 76 years. I'm not doing this because I enjoy an old coat and bad coffee. I'm doing it because I'm running out of time to get this right. This isn't only about the company, is it? She asked quietly. This search of yours. Arthur did not answer right away. When you get to be my age, he said finally, you start thinking less about what you built, more about who deserves to carry it forward. Holden looks at this company and sees numbers on a balance sheet. I built it because of people, real people. I'd like it to end up in the hands of someone who understands that difference. And you think a 19-year-old waitress in Maple Creek understands that difference? I think, Arthur said slowly. I've spent 30 years surrounded by people. People who learned how to want things from me. I'd like to meet, just once more, someone who simply wants to do right by strangers, no matter what's in their wallet. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded. Once. I'll pull together what background I can, she said, quietly. As always, thank you, Eleanor. She rose to leave, then paused at the study door. Arthur, she said. Holden is getting impatient. More impatient than usual. I'd be careful. Arthur nodded slowly, his eyes still on the fire. I know, he said. I've been careful my whole life, Eleanor. It's about time I stopped being careful about the wrong things. After she left, Arthur sat alone by the fire for a long while. He thought about all the years he had spent building something enormous. Buildings, contracts, a name people recognized on sight. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped asking the only question that ever really mattered. Not what a person owned, but what they were willing to give away when nobody was keeping score. He picked up the little notebook again and read Josie's line one more time. Kind without condition. Maybe, he thought, that was the only inheritance worth leaving behind. That afternoon in a lecture hall 20 minutes from the diner, Josie sat near the front of her nursing class. Notebook open, pen moving fast. Her instructor, a soft-spoken woman named Professor Adeline Sharp, stood at the front of the room, discussing patient dignity, not a subject most 18 and 19-year-olds found exciting. Josie found herself leaning forward anyway. Some of your patients will be difficult, Professor Sharp said, pacing slowly. Some will be confused, frightened, even unkind to you. Your job is not to decide who deserves your compassion. Your job is to give it anyway. A few students exchanged glances, the kind that suggested they had heard this speech before. A boy near the back raised his hand. What if they're rude, though? Like actually rude, not just scared. Then you still treat them with dignity, Professor Sharp said. Dignity isn't a reward for good behavior. It's something every person is owed simply for being human. You'll learn that the hard way more than once in this line of work. Josie wrote the sentence down, word for word. You will meet people, the professor continued, who look like they have nothing left to offer the world. An elderly patient with no visitors. A homeless man brought in with nobody to call. Every single one of them has a story you do not yet know. Josie thought of the old man in the gray coat, sitting quietly in her corner booth that morning, counting out crumpled bills with careful, trembling hands. She did not know his story either, not yet. But something told her it mattered more than most people in that diner had bothered to consider. Near the end of class, Professor Sharp put up a slide with 2 columns on it. One labeled acute conditions, the other labeled chronic conditions. You'll often see the 2 overlap in a single patient, she explained. A person managing something slow and steady for months, sometimes years. Then one day, something sudden and unrelated hits on top of it. The body doesn't wait for a convenient time. Neither does the rest of life, most days. Josie wrote that down too, though she could not have said why it struck her the way it did. After class, she walked out into the parking lot, her breath fogged in the cold afternoon air. 20 minutes home, in her mother's aging sedan. Back in Maple Creek, the evening settled over Willow Street like a heavy quilt. She parked in the driveway and grabbed her backpack, heavy with textbooks. The porch light was on at the small blue house near the end of the block. It always was, no matter how late she got home. She let herself in through the side door. Mom, she called. In here, honey. Vivian Merritt sat at the kitchen table, a half-finished dress spread out in front of her. Pins scattered across a small cushion by her elbow. A single lamp lit the fabric. Josie noticed, not for the first time, how close her mother held the fabric to her face. "How was class?" Vivian asked, not looking up. "Long," Josie said, dropping her bag by the door. "We started studying wound care today. Half the class almost passed out during the video. But not you." "Not me," Josie smiled faintly, sitting down across from her. "I think Dad's stubbornness skipped straight to me." Vivian laughed softly at that. A warm sound, but tired around the edges. "He was stubborn," she agreed. "In the good way. Mostly." Josie watched her mother's fingers move slowly over the fabric, feeling for the pins more than seeing them. "Mom," she said carefully, "your eyes have been doing that thing again, squinting like that. It's just tired eyes, sweetheart." "Long day. You said that yesterday too." Vivian set down her needle and finally looked up. In the lamplight, Josie could see it clearly now. A slight cloudiness at the edges of her mother's vision that had not been there a few months ago. "I have an appointment next week," Vivian admitted quietly. "Dr. Whitmore wants to run some tests." "What kind of tests?" "Something with the back of the eye," Vivian said, waving a hand like she could brush the words away. "He mentioned a word I didn't recognize. Something about the macula." Josie's stomach tightened. She had read enough in her first semester to know that word mattered. She also remembered, faintly, something Professor Sharp had said only hours earlier, about chronic conditions leaving a person more exposed to sudden ones. She pushed the thought aside for now. "How long has this been happening?" "A few months, maybe," Vivian admitted. "I didn't want to make a fuss over nothing." "Mom, this isn't nothing. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you have enough on your plate, Josie. Between school and the diner, I didn't want you worrying about one more thing." Josie reached across the table and took her mother's hand. "I'm always going to worry about you," she said simply. "That's not something you get to decide for me." Vivian squeezed her daughter's hand, her eyes glistening slightly. "You're so much like your father," she said. "He used to say things like that too. Like caring about people was just the most obvious thing in the world." Josie glanced toward the small shelf above the fireplace. A single photograph sat there in a plain wooden frame. Daniel Merritt, young and smiling, wearing a hard hat and a work jacket, the Whitfield Steel logo stitched over the chest pocket. Beside the photograph sat an old pocket watch, silver, slightly tarnished with age. It no longer kept accurate time. Nobody in the family had ever considered getting rid of it. It sat there the way old grief sometimes does, quiet and unmoving, waiting for something to finally set it going again. "Tell me about him again," Josie said softly. "The fire. What actually happened?" Vivian's expression grew distant. "You've heard the story 100 times. Tell me anyway." Vivian was quiet for a moment, her eyes drifting to the photograph. "There was a fire in one of the storage warehouses," she said slowly, "late at night. Most of the crew had already gone home. Your father was one of the last ones still on site, finishing paperwork. And he went back in," Josie said, finishing the sentence she had heard so many times before. "He went back in," Vivian confirmed. "There was somebody still inside. A young man, newer to the company. Your father wasn't going to leave him behind." "Did they ever find out who it was? The man he saved?" Vivian shook her head slowly. "The company handled everything so quietly back then," she said. "Settlements, paperwork. It all happened so fast. I barely had time to grieve before the lawyers were at our door with forms to sign." Something about the way her mother said that lingered in Josie's mind. She had never really questioned it before. She had been 7 years old when it happened, too young to ask the right questions. "Do you ever wonder," Josie said quietly, "if the company told us everything?" Vivian looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," Josie admitted. "It just feels strange. A man dies saving somebody's life, and nobody in this whole town even knows the name of the person he saved." Vivian was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached for her needle again, resuming her work on the dress. "Some things are better left in the past, honey," she said softly. "Your father wouldn't want us carrying anger over something so long ago." Josie nodded, though something in her chest did not fully settle. "Can I ask you something else?" she said. "Always. Do you ever regret it? Him going back in, I mean. If he'd just walked away that night, he'd still be here." Vivian set down her needle and thought about it for a long moment. The way she always did when Josie asked something that mattered. "Every single day," she admitted quietly. "And then I remember the man I fell in love with." He wouldn't have been able to live with himself if he hadn't gone back in, so I don't regret who he was. I only regret what it cost us. That's not really an answer, Mom. Vivian smiled a little sadly. No, she agreed. It isn't. Some things don't have a clean answer, honey. You'll learn that in nursing school faster than most people learn it in a lifetime. Josie glanced at the pocket watch on the shelf, silver and worn, forever frozen somewhere between 2 and 3 o'clock. I should start dinner, she said, standing up. I'll help, Vivian said, setting aside her sewing. But as Josie moved toward the kitchen, she noticed her mother pause by the shelf, running her fingers gently over the edge of the old photograph, the way she always did before letting the past go for the night. Later that night, after the dishes were dry, the lamp above the sewing table went dark. Josie lay in bed, thinking about the old man in the gray coat. She thought about the way he had counted his money so carefully, the way he had apologized for something that was not his fault. Most people never noticed men like that. Most people looked straight through them. Her father would have noticed him, she thought. He would have pulled up a chair. She fell asleep with that thought still turning over in her mind. She had no idea how close to the truth it actually was. The next morning, the diner was busy again. Same routine, same regulars, same steam rising off the griddle. Josie was refilling coffee at table 4 when the bell above the door rang. She looked up out of habit. It was him again, the old man in the gray coat. He stood near the entrance for a moment, glancing around the room the way he had the day before. Then his eyes found Josie, and something in his posture relaxed. She smiled and gestured toward the corner booth. Saved it for you, she said. He crossed the diner slowly and settled into the same seat as before. I wasn't sure you'd remember me, he admitted as she poured his coffee. Corner booth, black coffee, eggs and toast, Josie said, grinning. I remember my regulars. Regular, he repeated, testing the word like it was unfamiliar. I suppose I am becoming one, aren't I? Twice in 2 days, Josie said. I'd say that counts. Roy watched from across the room, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He had not opened the envelope from the day before. It still sat under the stack of invoices in the back office, waiting for a moment he was not yet ready to find. A few booths away, Walter Kavanagh lowered his newspaper slightly. He studied the old man for a long moment. There was something about the way the stranger sat, back straight, despite his age. Eyes tracking the room quietly, missing nothing. The way a man does when watching a crowd has been his job for most of his life. Walter had spent 3 decades reading people for a living. Something about this one did not add up. He said nothing. Not yet. He simply raised his newspaper again and kept watching over the top edge of it. But Josie did not notice any of it. She was already refilling sugar packets at another table, already moving on to the next task, already treating the strange old man in the frayed coat like anyone else. Exactly the same as everyone who walked through that door. Exactly the way her father would have wanted her to. Or so every story she had ever heard about him suggested. What Josie did not know, not yet, was this. 200 miles away, a young assistant working under Eleanor Grant had already begun digging, quietly pulling old employment records from the archives of Whitfield Steel, records from a warehouse fire 12 years old. Records that had a name on them. A name that would soon mean far more to Arthur Whitfield than Josie could possibly imagine. And in a glass office in Columbus, Holden Whitfield sat at his desk that same morning, scrolling through a private investigator's preliminary report. A report about a waitress named Josie Merritt and her father. He read the name twice, then a third time. His jaw tightened, and he closed the file without finishing it. There is a lesson older folks tend to know better than most. Money does not ask who deserves it. It simply sits there, waiting to see what a person does when nobody important is watching. Josie did not know she was being watched that week. She was not performing kindness for an audience. She was simply being who her father raised her, in his own quiet way, to become. Somewhere in Columbus, an old man was beginning to believe something, that he had finally found what he had been searching for. And somewhere else in that same city, a young man was beginning to realize something too. He might lose everything he had spent his whole life chasing. Neither of them yet understood how deeply their 2 stories had already been tied together. 12 years earlier, in the middle of a warehouse fire. A fire that changed more lives than anyone in Maple Creek had ever known. Back on Willow Street, the porch light burned steady against the dark. Inside, a mother and daughter shared a quiet dinner. unaware that a fortune, a family, and a long-buried truth were all quietly turning their way, all heading straight for their small blue house. Josie washed the dishes that night the same way she did every night, slowly, without complaint, thinking of nothing more than the tests waiting for her in the morning, and the mother who needed her more than either of them liked to admit. She had no idea. 200 miles away, a $5 bill sat folded inside an old leather wallet. It was already beginning to change the shape of her entire life. On the shelf above the fireplace, a pocket watch sat exactly where it always had, its hands still frozen somewhere between 2 and 3 o'clock, waiting, though nobody in that small house yet knew it, waiting for the day it would finally be allowed to move again. That story was still waiting to be told. Spring came slowly to Maple Creek that year. The snow melted in patches, then all at once, leaving the fields around town soft and brown. At the Copper Spoon, the mornings kept their same rhythm. Coffee at 5:30, bacon on the griddle by 6, the bell above the door ringing again and again, and nearly every week now Frank Doyle walked through it. He had become, in every visible way, a regular. He sat in the corner booth. He ordered the same simple breakfast. He left without fail the exact same $5 tip. Nobody questioned it anymore. Roy had stopped grumbling about the table. Denise had even started calling him Mr. Doyle with something close to warmth. Only Josie knew the truth was more complicated than that. Not the whole truth. Just enough of it to sense there was more beneath the surface. Some mornings, Frank arrived before the rush even started. He would sit quietly with his coffee, watching the town wake up outside the window. Trucks pulling into the hardware store lot, farmers loading feed sacks, old Gene Talbot shuffling in for his usual argument with Walter about the weather. "You ever notice," Frank said to her once, "how a town like this runs on the same handful of faces, year after year?" "I like that about it," Josie said, wiping down the counter beside him. "You always know where you stand with people." "Do you?" Frank asked. There was something careful in the question, like he was testing the weight of it. "Mostly," Josie admitted. "People here aren't perfect, but at least you know who they are." Frank nodded slowly, turning that thought over. Over the weeks, their conversations had grown longer. Frank asked about her classes. He asked about her mother's health, and remembered the answers the next time he came in. He asked, more than once, what she planned to do once she finished nursing school. "I want to work with older patients," Josie told him one gray Thursday morning, refilling his coffee. "People think that's less exciting than the ER or the surgical floor." "I don't think so." "Why not exciting?" Frank asked, genuinely curious. "Because people think older folks don't have anything left to say," Josie said. "I think that's backwards. I think that's when people finally have the most worth listening to." Frank was quiet for a moment, turning his mug slowly on the table. "That's a rare way of thinking for someone your age," he said. "My dad used to say something like that," Josie replied. "Or so my mom tells me." I don't really remember him saying it myself. I just remember the shape of it, passed down. "The shape of it," Frank repeated softly. "I like that phrase." He watched her for a moment longer, something working behind his eyes. "Can I ask you something, Josie? A strange question, maybe?" "Sure." "If you found out someone had wronged your family a long time ago and never once tried to make it right, what would you want from them? An apology? Money? Something else entirely?" Josie considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things Frank asked her. "Honesty, probably," she said finally. "Money doesn't undo anything. But knowing the truth, even a hard truth, at least lets you stop wondering." Frank nodded slowly, as if she had confirmed something he already suspected but needed to hear out loud. "That's a wiser answer than most people twice your age could manage," he said. "I just think people deserve to know things about their own lives," Josie said, shrugging, "even the parts that hurt." Josie smiled and moved on to the next table, unaware of how closely he was watching her walk away. Unaware of the note he wrote later that evening in his small leather book. "This one longer than the others. She reminds me why any of this was ever worth building in the first place." That same morning, while Josie carried plates and refilled cups 2 miles away, Vivian Merritt sat at her kitchen table, a stack of mending piled beside her, the radio playing low in the background. She had promised herself she would finish 3 dresses by Friday. Mrs. Caldwell needed hers for a wedding. The Pruitt twins needed matching Easter outfits. Her hands moved out of pure memory now more than sight. She had sewn for so many years that her fingers knew the fabric, sometimes before her eyes fully registered it. That morning, though, something felt different. A strange flicker at the edge of her vision, there and gone again before she could name it. She blinked hard, set down her needle, and rubbed her eyes. It's nothing, she told herself, just tired eyes. Same as always. She had been telling herself that same sentence for months now. Some quiet part of her had started to suspect it was no longer true. She thought about calling Dr. Whitmore's office to move up her appointment. Then she thought about the deductible on their insurance plan, and the cost of missing a day of work she could not really afford to miss. She picked her needle back up instead, and kept sewing. If Josie knew how bad it was getting, she thought, that girl would drop out of school in a heartbeat, just to take care of me. I won't let that happen. Not after everything her father already gave up for this family. She did not yet know how little choice either of them would have in the matter. Not by the end of that very day. Walter Kavanagh had spent 31 years reading people for a living. Retirement had not taken that instinct away from him. If anything, with nothing left to investigate, the habit had gotten louder in his quiet mornings at the diner. He watched Frank Doyle the way he used to watch a suspect across an interview table. Not with suspicion exactly, something closer to recognition. It was a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Frank's first visit, when the feeling finally sharpened into something specific. Frank was talking with Josie near the register, waiting on his check. Walter caught a single sentence drifting across the room. The truth has a way of surfacing eventually, Frank said. It just takes longer than most people have the patience for. Walter's coffee cup froze halfway to his mouth. He had heard that exact phrasing before. Decades ago, in a different room, under very different circumstances, he set his cup down slowly. Walter had spent the middle years of his career working corporate fraud cases out of the county seat, long before Maple Creek needed a full-time chief of its own. Insurance claims, workplace cover-ups, the occasional executive who thought his signature made him untouchable. He remembered interviewing men exactly like that. Careful men. Men who chose their words the way a surgeon chooses an instrument. One case in particular kept surfacing in his memory that morning, though he could not yet place why. A company executive, decades back, sitting across an interview table with his hands folded, answering every question with maddening precision. Never a wasted word, never a flash of temper, even when Walter pushed hard enough to make most men crack. Frank Doyle did not talk like an old man who had spent his life scraping by. He talked like a man who had once sat across a table from lawyers, a man who never once raised his voice. Walter watched him leave that morning, the bell above the door ringing once behind him. He did not say anything to Josie. Not yet. He was not entirely sure what he had noticed, only that it mattered. That evening, alone in his small house on the edge of town, Walter pulled a dusty box from the closet shelf. It had sat there untouched for years, gathering dust he had never once bothered to wipe away. Old case files, technically not his to keep, boxed up the day he retired instead of properly shredded. He did not know exactly what he was looking for, only that something about a stranger's voice had reached back 30 years and tapped him on the shoulder. He started reading. Roy Holt sat in his cramped office behind the kitchen, staring at a letter he had already read 4 times. It was not the first envelope he had let sit unopened on his desk. There had been others over the past few weeks, ones he had tucked under invoices, telling himself he would deal with them once things slowed down at the diner. Things never slowed down enough. This one he had finally opened. Heartland Community Bank. The header was familiar. The tone was not. Your business loan account is currently 31 days past due. Please contact our office immediately to discuss repayment options and avoid further action. Roy rubbed his eyes and set the letter down. He had taken the loan 2 years earlier, after a bad storm tore half the shingles off the diner's roof. $15,000, nothing enormous by big city standards, enough to keep him up at night in a town like Maple Creek. What most people in town did not know, and what Roy had only recently learned himself, was this. Heartland Community Bank had quietly become part of a larger financial network, a network with Whitfield Holdings sitting near the top of it. It was not a secret exactly. It was simply the kind of detail nobody bothered to mention, until it suddenly mattered. Roy had found out 3 weeks earlier, during a routine call with his loan officer. A friendly enough woman, apologetic even. She explained that the bank's new ownership structure came with stricter guidelines on late accounts. "I understand it's frustrating, Mr. Holt," she had said, "but corporate has been tightening things across the board this quarter." Corporate. The word had sat wrong in Roy's stomach ever since. He thought about his father, who built this diner with his own 2 hands. He thought about the 18 years he had spent keeping it standing, through good seasons and terrible ones. His father, Walt Holt, had opened the Copper Spoon back in 1962, back when Main Street still had a working movie theater and a shoe repair shop on the corner. Roy had grown up in the back booth, doing homework while his father flipped eggs. His father told the same 3 jokes to every customer who walked through the door. When his father passed, Roy had promised himself he would never let the place close, not on his watch. He had turned down a steady factory job twice to keep that promise. He never once regretted it, not until lately. He thought uncomfortably about the well-dressed young man who had come into his diner weeks ago, the one whose shoulder had clipped an old stranger's arm without so much as an apology. Roy did not know the young man's name, but something about the memory made him uneasy now, in a way he could not quite explain. He folded the letter and put it back with the others in his desk drawer, a small, growing stack of things he had not yet found the courage to face head-on. 200 miles away, in an office with a view of the Columbus skyline, Holden Whitfield sat behind his desk. He was not thinking about apologies at all. He was thinking about timing. His grandfather's cardiologist had scheduled a follow-up procedure for the coming week. Nothing life-threatening, according to the file Holden had quietly obtained. A routine repair to a valve that had been misbehaving since the scare in January. But routine or not, it was leverage. And leverage, in Holden's experience, did not last long once a patient recovered. He needed the estate documents settled before that surgery. Before Arthur's health improved enough for the board to stop worrying. Before they started asking harder questions about where the old man kept disappearing to, 3 or 4 times a week. Just that morning, the board chairman had called him directly. A short, tense conversation Holden had replayed twice already in his mind. "The shareholders are asking questions, Holden," the chairman had said. "Your grandfather built this company on a reputation for stability. Right now, stability is the one thing nobody can promise them. I'm handling it," Holden had told him. "Handle it faster," the chairman replied before ending the call. Holden had learned enough by now to know exactly where his grandfather went during those long, unexplained absences. The investigator's report sat open on his desk. Photographs of a small diner in Maple Creek. A young waitress named Josie Merritt, caught mid-laugh in one grainy image, carrying a tray of plates. And beneath the photographs, a name that had caught Holden's attention more than any other detail in the file. Daniel Merritt, Whitfield Steel employee. Deceased, warehouse fire, 12 years prior. Holden did not know the full story behind that fire. He had been a teenager when it happened. Away at boarding school, mostly shielded from the company's internal troubles. But he knew enough to recognize a loose thread when he saw one. His grandfather had grown unusually quiet whenever old warehouse incidents came up in board meetings. Holden had always assumed it was simple liability caution. Now, watching the pattern of his grandfather's diner visits, he was no longer sure. It all aligned too neatly with this particular waitress. Whatever the connection was, Holden intended to sever it, before it cost him everything he had spent his life working toward. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he rarely used. "Marcus," he said, once the call connected, "I need you to arrange something for me." Quietly, Marcus Webb had worked for the Whitfield family for 6 years, first as a junior analyst, now as something closer to Holden's personal fixer. He asked few questions. He asked even fewer once money was involved. They met 2 days later in a private dining room, a restaurant far enough from the office to avoid familiar faces. "I need a pen," Holden said, sliding a folder across the table. "A specific one." Marcus opened the folder. Inside was a photograph of an antique fountain pen, gold-trimmed, resting in a velvet-lined case. "That's a Montclair estate piece," Marcus said, recognizing the make immediately. "Limited run, early 1960s. Runs somewhere around $8,000, depending on condition." "I know what it costs," Holden said. "I need 2 of them, identical if possible." Marcus studied him for a long moment. "May I ask what this is for?" "No," Holden said. "You may not." Marcus nodded slowly and closed the folder. 6 years had taught him exactly when to stop asking. "I'll have them by Friday," he said. "Good," Holden replied. "And Marcus, I'll need a receipt in someone else's name, someone who has never set foot near Columbus." Marcus paused, understanding settling in slowly across his face. He did not say anything about it. He simply nodded again and reached for his coffee. "Consider it handled," he said. He hesitated before standing to leave, something almost like conscience flickering behind his eyes. "Can I ask you something, Holden? Off the record. You can ask. This girl, whoever she is she actually a threat to you? Or is this just about making sure she never gets close enough to matter?" Holden's expression did not change. "Does it matter which one it is?" Marcus studied him for a moment longer, then gathered his coat. "No," he admitted quietly. "I suppose it doesn't. Not to my paycheck, anyway." He left the private dining room without another word, the folder tucked under his arm, already dialing a jeweler in Cleveland who specialized in matching antique pieces on short notice. The following Monday, a well-dressed stranger walked into the Copper Spoon for the very first time. He was younger than most of the regulars, maybe mid-30s, wearing a coat that fit him the way expensive coats always seem to fit. He carried himself the way people do when they are used to rooms rearranging themselves around their presence. Josie did not recognize him. There was no reason she should have. She had only ever seen him once before, weeks earlier, brushing past an old stranger near the register without a second glance. "Table for one," he said, not quite looking at her. She led him to a booth near the window, the opposite end of the diner from Frank's usual corner. He ordered coffee and a plate of eggs, barely glancing at the menu. Throughout the meal, he made a show of setting a gold-trimmed fountain pen beside his coffee cup. He used it once to sign something on a folded piece of paper. Then he set it down again with obvious care, as though it mattered a great deal to him. Josie noticed it, the way anyone might notice something expensive in an ordinary place. She thought nothing more of it. When she leaned across the table to gather his empty plate, he shifted slightly to make room. The way any customer might, nothing unusual about it at all. What nobody in the diner noticed was his hand moving briefly near the edge of her apron, a small, practiced motion, over before it had really begun. By the time she carried the plate back toward the kitchen, the pen was already gone from the table. The man's expression shifted instantly. "Where's my pen?" he asked, his voice carrying just enough to draw a few glances from nearby tables. "I'm sorry?" Josie said, confused. "My pen. It was right here, next to my cup. I set it down not 2 minutes ago." Josie glanced at the table, at the empty space where the pen had been. "I didn't see anyone touch it, sir," she said carefully. "Maybe it fell or slipped into a napkin." The man stood, checking his coat pockets with theatrical urgency. "That pen is worth more than most people in this town make in a year," he said, loud enough now for the whole diner to hear. "It was a gift. It's irreplaceable." Roy came hurrying out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. "What seems to be the trouble?" he asked. "Your waitress cleared my table and my pen disappeared with it," the man said, his tone sharp and certain. Roy's eyes flicked toward Josie. "I didn't take anything, Roy," she said quietly. "I swear." The man crossed his arms. "I'd like someone to check her apron," he said, "before this goes any further." A heavy silence settled over the diner. A few customers stared openly now. Others suddenly found their coffee cups very interesting. Peggy Sue set down her crossword pencil, her mouth opened slightly. Gene Talbot leaned toward his neighbor and whispered something Josie could not quite hear. The tone of it stung regardless. Josie felt her face go hot. "You can check whatever you want," she said, her voice steady despite the shaking in her hands. "I have nothing to hide." Roy hesitated only a moment before nodding toward her apron pockets. Josie reached into the front pocket, expecting nothing. Her fingers closed around something cold and metal. She pulled it out slowly, a gold-trimmed fountain pen gleaming under the diner's fluorescent lights. The room seemed to tilt sideways. "That's not possible," Josie whispered. "I didn't put that there. I swear to you, I didn't." Her mind raced backward, trying to find the moment. She had cleared his plate. She had wiped down the table. She had never once opened her own apron pocket in between. None of it made sense, and the not making sense of it was almost worse than the accusation itself. The man's face arranged itself into a mask of disappointed certainty. "I think that speaks for itself," he said. Roy stood frozen for a long moment. The pen sat between them on the counter like an accusation nobody could take back. He looked at Josie, 19 years old, pale, shaking, her hands still trembling from the shock of pulling that pen out of her own apron. He had known this girl since she was 14, sweeping floors for pocket change after school. He did not believe, not for 1 second, that she had stolen anything. But he also thought about the letters sitting in his desk drawer, about the phrase corporate had been tightening things across the board, about a bank that answered, somewhere far up its ownership chain, to a name he knew well, a name that matched the one stitched onto his own late father's work jacket. It still hung in the back closet after decades of loyal service to that same steel company. He thought about all of that and hated himself a little for thinking it. "I have to call this in," Roy said quietly. "You understand that, right?" "I don't have a choice here, Roy," Josie said, her voice cracking. "Please, you know me." "I know," Roy said. His own voice sounded far away, even to himself. "I know, Josie. I'm sorry." He picked up the phone behind the counter. Walter Kavanagh, who had been sitting quietly through the entire scene, finally stood from his booth. "Roy," he said, his voice carrying the old authority of 31 years wearing a badge. "Slow down a minute. Let's think this through before anybody makes a call they can't take back." "There's a witness right here," Walter, the well-dressed man, said smoothly. The pen was in her apron. "What exactly is there to think through?" Walter studied the man carefully. Something about his composure struck him as wrong. Too smooth, too rehearsed, for a man supposedly furious over losing an $8,000 heirloom. "You got a name?" Walter asked. "Does it matter?" "It might," Walter said, "seeing as you're the one pressing charges." The man's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Holden," he said finally. Holden Whitfield. The name meant nothing to most of the room. It meant something to Walter, though he could not immediately place why. A flicker of recognition, gone before he could fully grasp it. Roy, phone still in his hand, dialed the number for the Maple Creek Police Department. The officer who arrived 20 minutes later was young, barely out of the academy, clearly uncomfortable with the weight of the situation unfolding in front of him. He took statements. He photographed the pen. He apologized more than once for the inconvenience, to everyone in the room except Josie. Given the value of the item and the direct evidence, the officer explained carefully, "I'll need to file a formal report. Ma'am, you'll have 24 hours to retain counsel before this moves forward." 24 hours. The words landed on Josie like a physical weight. "I didn't do this," she said, to the officer, to Roy, to the small crowd of onlookers who had stopped pretending not to watch. "I don't know how that pen got in my apron. I would never take anything that wasn't mine." Nobody in the diner answered her directly. A few people looked away. A few others whispered to each other, the way people do when they have already decided what they believe. Denise, standing near the kitchen door, caught Josie's eye for one brief moment. Then she looked down at the floor instead. It was not indifference, not exactly. Denise had worked alongside Josie for 2 years now. She had watched her hand over her own tip money more than once, whenever a family with young kids came up short. Something about the scene playing out in front of her did not sit right. But the officer was writing his report, and Roy was already reaching for the phone. Denise told herself there would be time to say something later, once things settled down. She would spend the next several days wishing she had said something now. Instead, Roy would not meet Josie's gaze at all. Only Walter stepped forward. "For what it's worth," he said, loud enough for the room to hear. "I've known this girl since she was in pigtails. She's never taken so much as a spare napkin that wasn't offered to her. I don't believe this for 1 second." "With respect, sir," the officer said gently, "the evidence tells its own story." Walter's jaw tightened. "Evidence can be arranged," he said quietly. "I spent 31 years learning that the hard way." Nobody in the room seemed ready to hear that yet. Not with a gold pen sitting on the counter, cold and undeniable under the fluorescent lights. Roy finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Josie," he said, "I think it's best if you head home for today. We'll figure the rest out once things settle down." It was as gentle a firing as Roy could manage, but it was a firing all the same, and everyone in the room understood it that way. Josie untied her apron with shaking hands and set it on the counter. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay." Her phone buzzed in her pocket as she reached the door, a message from her clinical coordinator at the nursing program. The kind of message that never arrived outside of business hours unless something was wrong. "Miss Merritt, we've been made aware of a pending police matter involving you. Per program policy, your clinical placement is suspended pending review. Please contact the office at your earliest convenience." Josie stared at the screen for a long moment, the words blurring slightly. 2 years of work. Every early morning shift, every exam, every hour spent memorizing anatomy, while her feet still ached from waiting tables. All of it suddenly balanced on the edge of a knife she had never even seen coming. She slipped the phone back into her pocket and walked out of the copper spoon without looking back. The bell above the door rang once behind her, the same way it rang for every customer who ever walked through it. Except this time, it did not feel like an ending anyone had chosen fairly. Roy stood behind the counter long after the crowd thinned out, staring at the spot where Josie's apron still sat folded, untouched. He picked it up eventually, running his thumb over the faded fabric. He thought about calling her, apologizing properly, telling her he would fight the accusation alongside her no matter what it cost him. Then he thought about the letters in his desk drawer and the word corporate sitting heavy in his stomach. He put the apron down without picking up his phone. He told himself he would make it right once the dust settled. He was not entirely sure he believed himself. Holden watched her go from just inside the diner window, careful to keep his expression neutral. Once she had disappeared down the sidewalk, he allowed himself a small private exhale. He collected his pen from the officer and thanked him for his professionalism. Then he made his way back to his car, parked a block away. Marcus was waiting behind the wheel. "Well?" Marcus asked as Holden climbed into the passenger seat. "Handled," Holden said, staring straight ahead. "You all right?" Holden did not answer right away. Something about the old police chief's face had stuck with him longer than he expected. That certainty in his eyes, the kind that came from decades of catching liars. "She's just a waitress," Holden said finally, more to himself than to Marcus. "This is business. Nothing more." His phone buzzed before Marcus could respond. His grandfather's name lit up the screen. Holden hesitated, then answered. "Grandfather, everything all right? Just checking in." Arthur's voice came through, tired but warm. "Wanted to hear your voice before the surgery next week."
"How's the office treating you?"
"Busy," Holden said, glancing out the window as Maple Creek slid past. "Nothing I can't handle." "That's my boy," Arthur said. "I know I don't say it enough, Holden, but I am proud of the work you do for this company." Holden's throat tightened unexpectedly. "Thank you," he managed. "That means a lot." "Get some rest," Arthur said. "I'll see you before the procedure." The call ended, and Holden sat holding the phone for a long moment, the diner already 3 blocks behind them. Marcus glanced over, saying nothing, though something in his expression suggested he understood exactly what that silence meant. Neither of them noticed the elderly man standing at the far end of the block. He watched the black sedan disappear around the corner, his own driver waiting patiently a few steps behind him. Arthur Whitfield had arrived at the diner 10 minutes too late to see any of it happen. He had only seen the aftermath. A crowd slowly dispersing. A young waitress walking briskly down Main Street, her shoulders shaking, wiping at her face with the back of one hand. He did not yet know her name was attached to any of it. He only knew, with the quiet certainty of a man who had spent decades reading rooms, something had gone very wrong. Arthur climbed back into the sedan, his expression troubled. "Everything all right, sir?" Charles asked, watching him in the rearview mirror. "I'm not sure," Arthur admitted. "Take me back to the office instead of home. I want to make a call." 20 minutes later, seated behind his desk with the door closed, Arthur dialed Eleanor's private line. "I need you to find out what happened at a diner in Maple Creek this afternoon," he said without preamble. "Something involving a young waitress." "Josie?" Eleanor asked, alarm creeping into her voice. "What kind of something?" "I don't know yet," Arthur admitted. "I saw her leaving in tears." A crowd outside the diner. I was too far away to hear anything clearly. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "I'll make some calls," she said. "Arthur, are you certain you want to stay hidden through this? If something serious has happened to her, perhaps it's time to simply step forward." Arthur rubbed his temple, weighing the question carefully. "Not yet," he said finally. "If I reveal myself now, over something I don't even understand yet, I risk making things worse. I need facts first, Eleanor, not assumptions. And if the facts are bad, then I'll do whatever needs doing," Arthur said quietly, "if I can manage it. Loudly, if I can't." He hung up the phone and sat alone in his office for a long while, staring at the small leather notebook resting on his desk. He thought about the 7 names that came before Josie's. 7 people who had looked promising at first glance, only to disappoint him later, one way or another. He wondered, with a discomfort he had not expected, whether he was about to add an 8th name to that list, or whether something else entirely was happening, something that had nothing to do with her character, and everything to do with forces neither of them yet understood. He did not sleep well that night. Eleanor Grant worked well past midnight in her home office. A stack of old company records spread across her desk. Arthur's call had unsettled her more than she let on. In 30 years of representing him, she had rarely heard that particular note of worry in his voice. She started where she always started, with the paper trail, employment records, insurance filings, the settlement documentation from the warehouse fire 12 years back, all of it sealed under confidentiality agreements she herself had helped draft at the time. She paused over one folder longer than the others. The name on its spine had faded, but the entries inside were as thorough as everything else she had ever filed for the family. She had drafted these agreements without ever once questioning what they were protecting. That thought sat uneasily with her now, in a way it never quite had before. Something about pulling those old files again so soon after Arthur's strange fixation on a Maple Creek waitress felt wrong. It sent a small chill down her spine. She was a careful woman by nature and by training. She did not believe in coincidence, not in matters this large. She made a note to call the county records office first thing in the morning. Then she finally allowed herself to go to bed, though sleep did not come easily for her either. Josie walked the 15 minutes home in a daze, barely feeling the cold March wind against her face. By the time she reached the small blue house on Willow Street, her hands had stopped shaking, replaced instead by a strange hollow numbness. She let herself in through the side door. "Mom?" No answer. She found her mother in the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter, her face pale and tight with pain. "Mom, what's wrong?" "It's my eye," Vivian said, her voice strained. "Something happened. There's this flashing like lightning, and now there's this dark curtain coming down over everything." Josie's training kicked in before her fear could catch up. "Sit down. Right now. Don't move your head too much." She guided her mother to a chair, her heart hammering against her ribs. "How long has this been happening?" "Just the last hour," Vivian said. "I thought it would pass." "It's getting worse, Josie. I can barely see out of the left side now." Josie recognized the signs immediately from her coursework. The sudden flashes, the encroaching shadow, the kind of emergency that could not wait for a scheduled appointment. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she heard Professor Sharp's voice again. That lecture about chronic conditions, and the sudden ones that sometimes rode in right behind them. "We need to get you to the hospital right now," she said, already reaching for her phone. "This can't wait. Josie, the cost. We can't just show up to the emergency room without knowing what it'll cost." "Mom." Josie's voice cracked, all the fear and exhaustion of the day breaking through at once. "I just lost my job. I got accused of stealing something I've never even seen. I don't care about the cost right now. I care about you not losing your eyesight." Vivian went quiet, absorbing the weight of what her daughter had just said. "You lost your job? What happened?" "I'll explain later," Josie said, already helping her mother toward the door. "Right now we need to go." The emergency room at Maple Creek General was quiet that evening, but the urgency in the intake nurse's face told Josie everything she needed to know. The moment she described her mother's symptoms. Within 20 minutes, Vivian was back in an examination room. A specialist was already being paged from the larger hospital in Columbus. Josie sat alone in the waiting room, her hands folded tightly in her lap, replaying the entire day over and over in her mind, the pen appearing in her apron, cold and impossible. Roy's apologetic, defeated expression. The officer's careful voice explaining her 24 hours. And now this. Her mother, possibly facing permanent vision loss, needing surgery that would cost money neither of them had. A doctor finally emerged just after 8 that evening, her expression calm but serious. "Your mother has a detached retina," the doctor explained. "It's treatable, but it's time-sensitive. We're looking at surgery within the next 48 hours to give her the best chance at preserving her vision." 48 hours, Josie repeated numbly. "I know that's fast," the doctor said gently. "I know it's a lot to process. but waiting longer significantly reduces the odds of a full recovery. Is this connected to the tests she had scheduled? Josie asked. The ones about her macula? Different mechanism, the doctor said. But the kind of chronic strain she's been managing can make an eye more vulnerable to a sudden event like this one. Josie nodded, though her mind was already spinning through numbers she did not have. Surgery costs, insurance deductibles, a paycheck that would no longer be coming. There's a financial counselor on staff who can walk you through payment options tomorrow, the doctor added gently. I know that's probably the last thing on your mind right now, but it might help to have that conversation early. Thank you, Josie said, though the words felt hollow even as she said them. Can I see her? Josie asked quietly. Of course, she's asking for you. Josie found her mother sitting up slightly in the hospital bed. A bandage already covered one eye, the other looking tired but alert. Hey, Mom, don't you dare apologize for anything, Vivian said immediately, reaching for her daughter's hand. I heard you talking to that doctor. I know what's coming. We'll figure it out, Josie said, though her voice betrayed how uncertain she felt. We always do, Vivian said softly. Your father used to say something like that too. Mom, I have to tell you something. The reason I lost my job today. Someone accused me of stealing a pen I never even touched. I don't know how it ended up in my apron, but it did. Now there's a police report. I have less than a day to figure out how to prove I didn't do it. Vivian's grip on her daughter's hand tightened. Josie Merritt, she said, using the full name she rarely used anymore. Look at me. I have known you your entire life. You have never once taken something that wasn't yours, not so much as a piece of penny candy from the corner store. You were 6 years old, and I know for a fact you wanted to. Despite everything, Josie let out a small, surprised laugh. I remember that, she said. I put it back on the shelf and cried the whole walk home. Exactly, Vivian said. That's who you are. Whatever happened today, whoever did this to you, the truth doesn't change just because it's inconvenient right now. It just needs time to catch up. I hope you're right. I know I'm right, Vivian said. I'm your mother. It's in the job description. Josie sat beside the bed for a long while, holding her mother's hand, watching the slow drip of the IV line. She thought about Professor Sharp's lecture from a few weeks earlier, about dignity being something every person deserved, not a reward for good behavior. She wondered if the officer who took her statement that afternoon believed that. She wondered if Holden Whitfield, whoever he really was, had ever once been taught the same lesson. Mostly, though, she thought about her mother's hand in hers. Thinner than she remembered it being even a year ago. She thought about the pocket watch, too, sitting untouched on their living room shelf, frozen forever somewhere between 2 and 3 o'clock, as if time itself had once decided that this family had already been asked to carry enough. She wondered, not for the first time, whether it would ever be allowed to start again. Across town, Walter Kavanagh sat at his kitchen table. He had lived alone in that small house since his wife passed 11 years earlier. Old case files spread out in front of him. He had been reading for hours, cross-referencing names, dates, incident reports, from a career that felt both impossibly long ago and strangely close at hand. Then he found it, a folder thin and yellowed with age, labeled simply Whitfield Steel, warehouse incident, 12 years back. His own handwriting filled the margins, notes from a case he had consulted on briefly, before the company's legal team quietly closed it out through settlements and non-disclosure agreements. Walter had never been fully satisfied with how quickly that case disappeared. He remembered saying as much to his captain at the time, being told, politely but firmly, to let it go. Something else caught his eye now, something he had underlined decades earlier, and apparently forgotten. A single name written in the margin, beside a note about a safety inspection that had been postponed twice before the fire. He did not recognize the name immediately. It took him a long moment, staring at his own younger handwriting before the pieces started shifting into place. He opened the folder now, decades later, and began reading through his old notes with fresh eyes. Somewhere in these pages, he suspected, sat the answer. The answer to why an old man in a frayed gray coat spoke like someone important. Someone who had once stood at the center of something far bigger than a diner breakfast. He did not yet know how directly that answer connected to the young waitress, the one currently sitting in a hospital waiting room 2 miles away, holding her mother's hand and wondering how she would ever pay for what came next. But something told him, the same instinct that had served him for 31 years. The two were not separate stories at all. They never had been. There is a lesson many people learn slowly, usually only after a lifetime of watching how the world actually works. Trouble rarely arrives from just one direction. It gathers first quietly, from several corners at once, long before anyone notices the storm taking shape. A young woman falsely accused, a mother's failing eyesight, a retired lawman piecing together a decades-old file, a wealthy old man hiding behind a borrowed name, uncertain how far to trust his own instincts. 4 separate threads pulling slowly toward the same small town, toward the same handful of people, none of them yet able to see the whole shape of what was coming. Somewhere between Willow Street and a lit study, 200 miles away, something was shifting. A fortune, a family, and a long-buried truth, all quietly drawing closer together. Whether any of it would arrive in time to matter was still, for now, an open question. Morning came slow and gray over Maple Creek General Hospital. Josie had not slept. She sat in a stiff plastic chair beside her mother's bed, watching the clock on the wall tick toward a deadline that felt impossibly close. 24 hours. That was what the officer had told her. 24 hours to retain counsel, or the report would move forward as a formal charge. She had no idea how to find a lawyer. She had no idea how to pay one, even if she could. Vivian stirred beside her, the bandage still covering one eye. "You didn't sleep," Vivian said, her voice thick with exhaustion. "Neither did you," Josie replied, forcing a small smile. "I'm the patient. I have an excuse." Josie reached for her mother's hand, saying nothing. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said the night before. She had spent the small hours scrolling through a list of legal aid numbers on her phone, most of them unanswered voicemail boxes at this hour. One office had promised a callback by 9. She kept checking the screen every few minutes, willing it to ring sooner. Down the hall, a nurse checked charts. Somewhere outside, a delivery truck rumbled past on its morning route. Life continued, indifferent to the two of them sitting in that small room, waiting on 2 separate clocks that refused to slow down. A young nurse popped her head in to check Vivian's vitals, offering Josie a sympathetic smile on her way out. Word of what had happened at the diner had already made its way through parts of town overnight, the way things always did in Maple Creek. Josie did not know whether to feel comforted or exposed by that. Mostly, she just felt tired in a way sleep alone would not fix. Walter Kavanagh had not slept either. He sat at his kitchen table as the sun came up. The old case file lay spread open in front of him, a fresh pot of coffee going cold beside it. He had read through the file 3 times now. Each pass revealed something new, something his younger self had noted but never fully understood the weight of. A safety inspection postponed twice in the weeks before the fire. A memo buried in an appendix warning that the warehouse's electrical wiring needed replacing before it became a hazard. A supervisor's signature approving deferral of the repair, citing budget constraints for that quarter. And a witness statement, taken the week after the fire, from a young engineer who had survived. Walter read that statement again, slower this time. The witness described being trapped near the loading dock when the fire spread faster than anyone expected. He described a warehouse foreman who came back in through the smoke, found him, and half-carried him out through a side exit before the roof gave way. The witness never gave his rescuer's full name in the statement, only a first name, Daniel. Walter set the paper down, his hands trembling slightly. He got up and poured the cold coffee down the sink, filling a fresh cup instead. He needed a moment before he could keep reading. 31 years on the job had taught him plenty about coincidence. This did not feel like one. He looked at the top of the statement, at the witness's typed name, Arthur J. Whitfield. Walter sat back in his chair, staring at the page for a long moment. The pieces of a puzzle he had not known he was solving finally locked into place. He thought about Frank Doyle's careful voice at the diner counter, about the way the old man chose his words like a man used to being quoted, and misquoted, by people with far more power than a small-town waitress. He thought about Josie sitting in a hospital room right now, facing a stolen accusation. The truth of who Frank Doyle really was sat buried in a box in his own closet. It had sat there for years, without either of them knowing it. Walter did not waste any more time deciding what to do next. 200 miles away, Eleanor Grant had also been awake most of the night. By 7 that morning, she had assembled enough documentation, enough to make her hands shake slightly. as she carried the folder into Arthur's study. He was already awake, seated by the cold fireplace, still in yesterday's clothes. "You didn't go to bed," Eleanor said. "Neither did you, apparently," Arthur replied, nodding toward the folder in her hands. Eleanor sat down across from him and opened the folder. "I need to show you something," she said, "about the pen." Arthur leaned forward. "I had someone trace the jeweler," Eleanor continued, "a shop in Cleveland specializing in antique fountain pens. 2 identical Montclair estate pieces were purchased 11 days ago, paid for in cash, under a name that doesn't match anyone connected to the diner or the police report." "Whose name?" "A shell name," Eleanor said. "But the transaction was arranged by a man named Marcus Webb." Arthur's face went still. "Holden's assistant," he said quietly. "Holden's assistant," Eleanor confirmed. "I made a call to Mr. Webb this morning, Arthur. Told him what I'd found and told him exactly what kind of trouble accessory to fraud carries. He didn't deny it. He gave me a full statement within 20 minutes. Arthur closed his eyes. "Holden set that girl up," he said, deliberately. "It appears that way," Eleanor said gently. "I'm sorry." Arthur sat in silence for a long moment, his jaw tight. His hands stayed folded in his lap. That was always the sign he was working hardest to control his temper. "There's more," Eleanor said. "There's always more with you, Eleanor. While I was tracing the pen purchase, I found something else. Irregularities in the Whitfield Cares Foundation accounts. Transfers that don't match any approved grant, all authorized under Holden's signature over the past 18 months. Arthur opened his eyes slowly. "How much?" "Just over $400,000, Eleanor said, routed through vendor invoices that don't appear to correspond to any real services rendered. Arthur exhaled a long, tired breath. "I built that foundation for my late wife," he said quietly. "She would be devastated." He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the quiet grounds of the estate, the same view he had looked out on for nearly 50 years. "I keep asking myself where I went wrong with him," Arthur said. "Holden had everything, every advantage I never had at his age. And somewhere along the way, I raised a boy who thought differently, who thought stealing from sick children was an acceptable cost of doing business." "You didn't raise a thief, Arthur," Eleanor said. "You raised a grieving child, then handed him a company before he'd finished grieving. Somewhere in between, he made his own choices. That part isn't on you." "I know," Arthur said. "I only wish knowing made it hurt less." "I know," Eleanor said. "I'm sorry to bring you all of this at once." "No," Arthur said, standing slowly. "You did exactly what I asked you to do. Find the truth. I only wish the truth had been kinder this time." His phone rang before Eleanor could respond. An unfamiliar Ohio number. Arthur answered on the second ring. "Arthur Whitfield," he said. "Mr. Whitfield," an unfamiliar voice replied, older, careful. "My name is Walter Kavanagh. I believe we've met before. Though you knew me by a different name for you at the time, I think we need to talk. About a fire at your family's steel plant 12 years ago. And about a man named Daniel Merritt." Arthur's grip on the phone tightened. "I'm listening," he said. Walter explained everything he had pieced together, laying it out carefully, the way he used to lay out evidence for a jury decades earlier. The postponed safety inspection, the ignored electrical memo, the witness statement bearing Arthur's own name. Arthur listened without interrupting, his free hand pressed flat against the cold fireplace mantel, as though he needed something solid to hold on to. "I remember that night, Mr. Kavanagh," Arthur said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was 64 years old, and certain I was about to die in that building. A man came through the smoke and got me out. I never learned his full name. My father's people handled the settlement before I'd even left the hospital. I was told the family had been taken care of. I believed that. I shouldn't have." "It wasn't taken care of," Walter said quietly. "Not the way it should have been." Arthur closed his eyes. "His daughter," he said slowly, the realization arriving in full now. "All at once, like a wave finally breaking after years of gathering strength, Josie. Her father was the man who saved my life." "Yes," Walter said. "And right now, that young woman is sitting in a hospital waiting room, facing criminal charges over a crime she didn't commit, because your grandson decided she was a threat worth eliminating." Arthur's hand shook slightly against the mantel. "Where is she now?" "Maple Creek General," Walter said. "Her mother's in for emergency surgery. I'd suggest you get here quickly, Mr. Whitfield. There isn't much time left on either of her clocks." Arthur hung up the phone and turned to Eleanor. His expression had transformed entirely from the tired, guarded man who had sat by the fire moments earlier. "Get the car," he said. "We're going to Maple Creek now." "Arthur, what's happening?" "I'll explain everything on the way," Arthur said, already moving toward the door. "But Eleanor, bring every document you have, the pen. The foundation transfers, all of it. Today is the day I stop hiding." Eleanor gathered the folder and followed him out, already dialing Charles to bring the car around. The drive to Maple Creek took just under 2 hours. Arthur spent most of it in silence, staring out the window at the passing farmland. The leather notebook rested closed in his lap. Eleanor did not push him to talk. She had known Arthur long enough to recognize when a man needed quiet more than conversation. She simply reviewed her documents one final time, making certain every piece of evidence sat exactly where she would need it. Somewhere past the county line, Arthur finally spoke. 12 years, Eleanor," he said. 12 years I told myself I was honoring his memory by building something worthwhile. I never once considered that the simplest honor would have been finding his daughter and telling her the truth." "You're doing it now," Eleanor said gently. "Now," Arthur repeated. "After she nearly lost everything because of my own grandson. That timing haunts me more than I can say." Eleanor reached over and rested a hand briefly on his arm. "Better late than never isn't just a saying, Arthur," she said. "Sometimes it's the only mercy left available to us." Arthur was quiet for a while after that, watching the fields blur past the window. "She said something to me once," he said finally. "Weeks ago, at the diner. I asked her, in a roundabout way, what she'd want. From someone who had wronged her family and never made it right. She didn't say money. She said honesty. She said the truth is the only thing that lets a person stop wondering." "Sounds like good advice," Eleanor said. "It is," Arthur said. "I intend to follow it exactly, whatever it costs me." Marcus Webb sat in a diner 2 towns over from Columbus, staring at a cup of coffee he had not touched in 20 minutes. His phone buzzed. A text from Holden. "Board call in an hour. Need the final signature pages ready." Marcus stared at the message for a long moment before setting the phone face down on the table. He thought about the young waitress he had watched get walked out of that diner, practically in handcuffs, over a pen that had never been stolen at all. He thought about the 6 years he had spent telling himself that loyalty and complicity were different things. Deep down, he had always known better. He thought about his own daughter, 7 years old, waiting for him at home most evenings with drawings taped to the refrigerator door. What kind of example he was setting, staying quiet, while a young woman lost her job, and very nearly her mother's chance at treatment over a pen that had never gone missing at all. He picked the phone back up and typed a different message. "To Holden. To Eleanor Grant. I'll testify to everything. Full statement on the record. I should have said no from the start." He sent it before he could talk himself out of it. Then, for the first time all morning, he took a sip of his coffee. It had gone cold, but it tasted better than it had any right to. Holden Whitfield sat in his office reviewing quarterly projections when his assistant knocked on the glass door. "Sir, there's a call. Eleanor Grant. She says it's urgent." Holden waved her in, mildly annoyed at the interruption. "Eleanor," he said, picking up the phone. "I'm rather busy this morning." "I imagine you are," Eleanor said, her voice cool and even. "I wanted to give you the courtesy of a warning before the board finds out on their own." "Finds out what, exactly?" "That the copper spoon incident was staged," Eleanor said. "That you purchased 2 identical antique pens through Marcus Webb and had one planted in a young woman's apron. Marcus has already given a full statement." The color drained from Holden's face. "That's absurd," he said, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "I also found the foundation transfers, Holden," Eleanor continued. $400,000 routed through vendors that don't exist. Your signature is on every authorization." Holden said nothing for a long moment. "Your grandfather is on his way to Maple Creek right now," Eleanor said, "with every piece of evidence. I suggest you consider your next move very carefully." "Eleanor? Wait." Holden's voice cracked slightly, the polish finally slipping. "Can we talk about this? Just the 2 of us, before anyone else gets involved?" "There's nothing left to discuss, Holden," Eleanor said. "You should have thought of that before now. Before you decided a 19-year-old waitress was an acceptable casualty in your plan. I never meant for it to go this far," Holden said quietly. "Her mother, the hospital, none of that was supposed to happen." "Consequences rarely ask permission before they arrive," Eleanor said. I'll see you in a courtroom, Holden. I truly am sorry it came to this. She ended the call before he could respond. Holden sat frozen behind his desk, the quarterly projections forgotten entirely. His carefully built world began cracking apart at every seam he had spent years reinforcing. The black sedan pulled into Maple Creek just after 11 that morning. Charles navigated the familiar streets toward the hospital instead of the diner this time. Arthur sat in the back seat, no longer wearing his gray coat, no longer Frank Doyle at all. He wore a simple dark suit, the closest thing to formal he owned that did not scream wealth from across a room. He held the small leather notebook in his lap, running his thumb over its worn cover. "Nervous?" Eleanor asked, seated beside him. "Terrified," Arthur admitted. "I've spent 12 years wondering about this family, Eleanor. Wondering if I'd ever find them. Wondering what I would even say if I did." "What are you going to say?" Arthur was quiet for a moment, watching Main Street pass by the window, the same street he had walked down in a frayed gray coat, invisible to nearly everyone who saw him. "I'm going to say thank you," he said finally, "and then I'm going to spend whatever time I have left, making sure her family never has to worry about money again." The car pulled up outside Maple Creek General. Josie was standing in the hallway outside her mother's room on the phone with the hospital's financial counselor. Her voice stayed tight with barely controlled panic when she saw them. "I understand," she was saying into the phone, "but I don't have that kind of money right now. I need to know what happens if we can't cover the deposit before the surgery window closes." An elderly man in a dark suit walking briskly through the hospital doors, a silver-haired woman beside him carrying a thick folder, and behind them, unmistakably, Walter Kavanagh. Josie ended the call and stood frozen, watching Frank Doyle approach her, dressed like an entirely different person. For a moment, she genuinely wondered if exhaustion had finally caught up with her, if she was imagining the familiar face attached to an unfamiliar suit. "Frank?" she said, confusion written across her face. "What's going on? Why are you dressed like that?" "Josie," he said gently, stopping a few feet away. "I owe you an explanation, several actually, and I'm afraid we don't have much time to waste getting to them." "I don't understand." Walter stepped forward. "Josie," he said, "this is Arthur Whitfield, owner and chairman of Whitfield Holdings. He's been coming into the diner for weeks under a different name." Josie stared at Arthur, the pieces refusing to settle into place. "Frank Doyle is Arthur Whitfield? I know it's a great deal to absorb all at once," Arthur said. "I promise I'll explain everything, every choice I made and why. But first, there's something more urgent I need to tell you before we discuss anything else." "More urgent than you lying to me for a month?" Josie asked, hurt creeping into her voice despite everything. "Yes," Arthur said quietly. "It's about your father. They found an empty consultation room down the hall." Arthur closed the door behind them, his hands trembling slightly as he set the leather notebook on the table. 12 years ago, he began, "There was a fire at Whitfield Steel. I was 64 years old, not fully in charge of the company myself, not while my father was still alive. Everyone still called me the chairman's son, no matter how many years I'd put in." Josie sat very still, listening. "I was trapped near the loading dock when the fire spread. I thought I was going to die there. And then a man came through the smoke, a warehouse foreman. He found me and half carried me out through a side exit, moments before the roof came down over where we'd been standing." Josie's breath caught in her throat. "He went back in," Arthur continued, his voice thickening with emotion he had clearly been holding back for years. "Someone told him there was still one more person inside. He didn't hesitate, Josie. He just went back in." "That's my father," Josie whispered. "That's the story my mother always told me." "Yes," Arthur said. "Your father saved my life, and I never got the chance to thank him, because he never made it back out." Tears ran freely down Josie's face now. 12 years of half-answered questions finally arriving at something solid. "Why didn't you find us?" she asked, though there was no accusation in her voice, only grief. "Why did it take so long?" "My father handled everything," Arthur said. "Settlements, statements, all of it buried under confidentiality agreements before I even left the hospital bed. I asked for your family's information. I was told it had been taken care of. I believed him, Josie. I was still his son first and a chairman second, and I trusted the wrong person." He paused, gathering himself before continuing. "I understand now that my father wasn't protecting your family that day," he said. "He was protecting the company, protecting himself and by extension, me. I've had 12 years to sit with that realization, and it never gets any easier to say out loud. You weren't in charge yet, Josie said softly. You didn't make that choice. No, Arthur agreed. But I inherited the silence that came from it, and silence left alone, long enough, can do almost as much damage as the original wrong. He opened the leather notebook and slid it across the table toward her. I've spent 12 years searching, in every way I knew how, quietly, without fully understanding what I was even looking for, until the day I walked into your diner and ordered a cup of coffee. That day I left you $5 I could barely spare. Josie stared down at the notebook, at her own name written on the very first page, followed by 6 words that suddenly meant everything. Kind without condition. Josie Merritt, Daniel's daughter. You knew, she said softly, the very first day. You already suspected. I suspected nothing that first day, Arthur admitted. I only saw kindness, and it moved me more than I expected. It wasn't until Walter called me this morning that I understood who you truly were. Josie closed the notebook slowly, holding it against her chest. All those mornings, she said, almost to herself, you sat in that booth, and I had no idea I was serving the man my father died saving. I keep thinking, if I'd known, what would I have even said to you? You already said everything that mattered, Arthur told her. Every single morning, without knowing any of it. That's what convinced me, Josie. Not the connection to your father, the kindness that came before I ever knew there was one. He hesitated, then added something else. Do you remember asking me, weeks back, what a person would want from someone who had wronged their family and never made it right? You said honesty, not money, just the truth. I remember, Josie said quietly. I've thought about that answer every day since, Arthur said. It's why I'm telling you all of this myself instead of sending Eleanor with a check and a letter. You earned the truth. Whatever comes after that is yours to decide. My mother needs surgery, she said, within the next 24 hours. And I might be facing criminal charges by tomorrow, over a pen I never even touched. Not anymore, Arthur said firmly. Eleanor has full evidence that my grandson orchestrated the entire theft accusation. Marcus Webb has already given a statement. As for your mother's surgery, that concern ends today. Whatever it costs, it's handled. Eleanor made 3 phone calls from the hospital hallway over the next hour. The first was to the Maple Creek Police Department. She provided Marcus Webb's signed statement and requested the theft report against Josie be formally withdrawn. The second was to the hospital's billing department. She authorized full coverage for Vivian Merritt's surgery and recovery under the newly established Whitfield Family Medical Fund, effective immediately. The third was to Holden Whitfield's attorney. She informed him that formal charges for fraud, false accusation, and foundation embezzlement would be filed by end of day. By early afternoon, the young officer who had taken Josie's statement the day before returned to the hospital in person. His expression looked sheepish as he approached her in the waiting room. Ms. Merritt, he said, I owe you an apology. We're closing the case. All charges withdrawn, effective immediately. Josie let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for a full day. Thank you, she said quietly. For what it's worth, the officer added, I never fully bought it either. Something about the whole thing felt wrong from the start. I've been doing this job 3 years, and you learn to trust that feeling more than you'd think. I appreciate you saying that, Josie said. It means more than you probably realize. Your apron's still sitting behind the counter at the diner. By the way, he added, almost as an afterthought, Mr. Holt asked me to mention it. If I saw you. Said it's got your name on it and nobody else's. He nodded to Walter on his way out. A silent acknowledgement between 2 men who had both trusted their instincts over the evidence in front of them. Vivian's surgery took place that evening, comfortably within the 48-hour window the doctor had given her. Josie sat in the waiting room with Arthur beside her. An unlikely pair, the tycoon and the waitress, bound now by something far deeper than a $5 tip. Tell me about him, Arthur said quietly during the long wait. Your father. I only knew him for the length of one terrifying night. I'd like to know who he really was. Josie smiled through her exhaustion. He liked to fix things, she said. My mom says he could repair almost anything with his hands. He used to whistle songs while he worked, off-key every single time. He proposed to my mother in this diner, actually. The Copper Spoon. Right there in that same corner booth you always sat in. Arthur's eyes went wide with something like wonder. I had no idea, he said. I chose that booth entirely by accident. Maybe it wasn't an accident, Josie said softly. Maybe some things just find their way back around. What else do you remember about him? Arthur asked. Or what your mother's told you, at least. He used to leave notes in my lunchbox, Josie said, even when I was too little to read them myself. My mom would read them to me at the table. Silly little things, mostly. Have a good day, kiddo. Don't trade your apple for candy again. Arthur laughed softly at that, though his eyes were wet. He sounds like a good man, he said. The kind of man worth building something in honor of. He was, Josie said simply. Everyone who knew him says the same thing. They sat together in comfortable silence after that. Finally, just before 9 that evening, the surgeon emerged with good news. The procedure had gone smoothly. Vivian's vision, with time and careful recovery, was expected to return in full. Josie cried again, this time from relief instead of grief. Arthur, without quite meaning to, found himself blinking back tears of his own. Back at the Copper Spoon, news of the day's events had already begun spreading through Maple Creek, the way news always spread in a town that size, quickly and thoroughly, embellished slightly with each retelling. Roy sat in his cramped office that evening, staring at an email that had just arrived from Heartland Community Bank. Notice of loan forgiveness in full, effective immediately, under new community reinvestment initiative sponsored by Whitfield Holdings. Roy read it 3 times before he fully believed it. He thought about Josie's folded apron, still sitting on the shelf behind the counter where he had left it. He picked up his phone and dialed her number, his hands shaking slightly. Josie, he said when she answered. I need to apologize to you properly. Not over the phone. In person, whenever you're ready to hear it. I know, Roy, Josie said gently. I already know. I should have believed you, Roy said. I let fear make a decision that should have been about trust. You were scared, Josie said. I understand that more than you might think. Your job is waiting for you, Roy said. Whenever you're ready. And Josie, I mean this. Take all the time you need. Denise, overhearing the tail end of the conversation from across the diner, wiped at her own eyes. The corner of her apron caught the tears before they fell. She quietly promised herself she would say something kinder sooner, the next time it mattered. The night before the gathering, Josie sat with her mother on the small back porch. A cup of tea cooled between them. Are you ready for tomorrow? Vivian asked. I don't know, Josie admitted. It still doesn't feel real. Any of it. A month ago I was worried about affording textbooks. Now there's a trust fund with Dad's name on it. He would be so proud of you, Vivian said. Not for the trust fund. For the $5 that started all of it. For treating a stranger like he mattered before you had any idea who he was. Josie looked out over the darkened yard, the same yard she had played in as a little girl. Back when her father was still just a photograph and a handful of secondhand stories. I keep thinking about what he must have felt, walking into our lives again like that, Josie said. 12 years of guilt, just waiting for the right moment to finally say something. Guilt is a heavy thing to carry alone for that long, Vivian said. I'm glad he finally set some of it down. They sat together a while longer, listening to the crickets, neither one needing to fill every silence with words. 3 days later, on a bright Saturday morning, the Copper Spoon filled up. More people than it had seen in years. Word had spread of a gathering, something between a celebration and a community meeting. Nearly the entire town of Maple Creek had turned out to see it. Extra chairs had been borrowed from the church hall down the street. Someone had set up a folding table with coffee and pastries near the door. Children Josie recognized from the elementary school peeked in through the front window, curious about the fuss. Arthur stood near the corner booth, Josie beside him. Vivian sat nearby with a fresh bandage still protecting her healing eye, Walter and Eleanor standing just behind them. Josie squeezed Arthur's hand once before he stepped forward, a small gesture of encouragement he seemed to genuinely need. You don't have to say all of it today, she whispered. Yes, Arthur said quietly, I do. This town gave me something I didn't deserve. All those weeks. Honesty in return is the least I owe it. He cleared his throat and held up the small leather notebook for the room to see. Many of you knew me these past weeks as Frank Doyle, he said. His voice carried easily through the quiet diner. I owe this town an apology for that deception, he continued. I hope in time you'll understand why. I needed the truth of people's character more than I needed their comfort. A murmur passed through the crowd, curious rather than hostile. 12 years ago, Arthur continued, a man named Daniel Merritt saved my life in a fire at my family's steel plant. A fire that happened, in part, because my own company ignored a safety warning, one that should have been addressed months earlier. Gasps rippled through the room. Josie squeezed her mother's hand. I have spent every year since trying to understand how to properly honor that debt, Arthur said. I believe I've finally found the answer. He opened the notebook and held it toward the crowd, though only those closest could actually read the words. Today, I'm announcing the creation of the Daniel Merritt Trust, Arthur said, a fund dedicated to covering medical costs, educational scholarships, and emergency support for working families throughout this county. Josie Merritt will serve as a founding director, alongside Eleanor Grant. Josie's hand flew to her mouth, overwhelmed. Would you like to say anything? Arthur asked her quietly. Josie hesitated, then stepped forward, her voice shaking slightly as the whole room turned to face her. I don't really know what to say, she admitted, a small, nervous laugh escaping her. A month ago, I was just trying to keep my grades up and cover my mom's medication. I never imagined any of this. She looked down at the notebook still open in Arthur's hands. My dad used to leave me notes in my lunchbox, she said. Little things. Have a good day, kiddo. I like to think, if he could see this, he'd tell me the same thing right now. Just go have a good day, and let the rest take care of itself. A soft ripple of laughter and quiet tears moved through the room. I promised to run this trust the way he would have wanted, Josie continued, quietly, fairly, and always asking who needs it, never who deserves it. Because I've learned this past month that those two questions aren't always the same thing. The fund begins, Arthur continued, with an amount equal to every dollar my family's negligence ever cost the people who worked for us, adjusted honestly for the years we spent pretending otherwise. The room fell into stunned silence for a moment, then erupted into applause. Peggy Sue wiped tears with her crossword napkin. Jean Talbot clapped so hard his coffee nearly spilled. Vivian rose slowly from her seat, one hand steadying herself against the table. I'd like to add something, if I may, she said, her voice carrying despite its softness. The room quieted again. My husband never got to see the man he saved grow old, Vivian said. He never got to know he mattered so much to a stranger's whole life. But I think he'd be glad, more than anything. Glad to know his daughter still carries his kindness forward, same as he always hoped she would. She looked toward Arthur. Thank you for finding us, she said simply. It's taken 12 years, but you finally did. Arthur crossed the room and took her hand gently in both of his. Thank you for raising a daughter exactly like him, he said. Walter cleared his throat from where he stood near the door, clearly trying to keep his own composure. For the record, he said, a little gruffly, I always figured that old case deserved a better ending than the one it got. Feels good to finally be right about something after all these years. A ripple of warm laughter moved through the crowd. Roy stepped forward from behind the counter, clearing his throat, waiting for the applause to settle. I'd like to say something too, if that's all right, he said, his voice a little unsteady. The room quieted, turning toward him. I've owned this diner for 18 years, Roy said. My father before for longer than that. I always thought I knew what it meant to run a good business. Fair prices, honest work, taking care of the people who walked through that door. He looked at Josie. I forgot the most important part of that. When it mattered most, he continued. I let fear make a decision that should have been about trust. Josie, I'm sorry. In front of everyone who was here to see me fail you. I want you to hear me say it properly. Josie crossed the room and hugged him, the crowd breaking into a softer, warmer round of applause. You're forgiven, Roy, she said. We all get scared sometimes. Later that same afternoon, once the crowd had thinned, the diner returned to something closer to its ordinary rhythm. Arthur pulled a small framed object from his coat pocket and set it gently on the counter. Inside the frame sat a single $5 bill, slightly worn, carefully preserved. I had Eleanor track down the actual bill, Arthur admitted, a little sheepishly. It wasn't easy. Turns out banks don't usually keep individual notes traceable. Josie laughed, wiping fresh tears from her cheeks. You didn't have to do that. I wanted to, Arthur said. That $5 changed the entire direction of my life, Josie. It seemed only right that it hang somewhere people could see it. Roy found a spot for it above the register, right beside a small brass plaque that Walter had quietly commissioned without telling anyone. He had ordered it from an engraver 2 towns over, the very morning after the truth came out. He paid for it himself out of his modest pension. He wanted some small permanent marker in the diner to remind people what had almost been missed. The plaque read simply, "Kindness costs nothing. It is worth everything." Josie reached into her own coat pocket and pulled something out. She turned it over once in her hand before setting it on the counters beside the framed bill. Her father's old pocket watch. Silver, slightly tarnished, the hand still frozen somewhere between 2 and 3 o'clock. "I brought this today too," she said. "It's been sitting on our shelf since before I can remember. It stopped working the night of the fire. Mom never had the heart to get it fixed." Arthur picked it up carefully, studying the worn casing. "May I?" he asked. Josie nodded. The following week, Arthur sent it quietly to a watchmaker in Columbus, an old family friend known for restoring pieces most jewelers considered beyond saving. It came back 3 weeks later, cleaned, repaired, and ticking steadily for the first time in 12 years. Josie wound it every morning after that, keeping it on the same shelf beside her father's photograph. It never quite kept perfect time, but it kept moving forward, the way she had decided she would too. As for Holden Whitfield, the board of Whitfield Holdings voted unanimously. They removed him from his position within the week. This followed formal charges of fraud, false accusation, and embezzlement from the Whitfield Cares Foundation. He would face his consequences in a courtroom rather than a boardroom. That fact seemed to weigh on Arthur more than anyone might have expected. Holden pleaded guilty to the fraud and embezzlement charges 3 weeks later, avoiding a lengthy trial. The judge sentenced him to restitution and probation, along with a formal ban from serving as an officer of any charitable organization for the next decade. Arthur attended the hearing, sitting quietly in the back row. Holden did not look at him once, not until the very end. Bailiffs prepared to lead him out for processing. Their eyes met across the courtroom for a brief moment. Arthur nodded once, slowly. Holden looked away first, his jaw tight, something unreadable passing behind his expression. "I keep thinking about what made him this way," Arthur admitted to Eleanor one evening, weeks later. "I raised him after his parents died. I taught him everything I knew about running a company. I only wonder now whether I taught him enough about running a life." "You can't carry that alone," Eleanor said gently. "He made his own choices, Arthur." "I know," Arthur said, "but I intend to visit him once the legal matters settle. Whatever he's done, he's still the boy I raised. I owe him that much at least." Marcus Webb, for his part, was never charged. His statement had been given freely and completely. The district attorney's office made a point of noting his full cooperation. He kept his job with the family, though a different one now, working directly under Eleanor instead. He told his daughter that evening, once she was old enough to understand it, doing the right thing late was still better than never doing it at all. Spring deepened into summer across Maple Creek, and life at the Copper Spoon settled into a new, gentler rhythm. Josie returned to nursing school with her clinical placement fully restored. The program's dean personally called to apologize for the suspension. Once the truth had come fully to light, Professor Sharp pulled her aside after the first class back. She told her quietly that she hoped Josie would teach the same lesson someday. A lesson on dignity passed on to students of her own. Vivian's vision returned steadily, week by week. By early June, she could thread a needle again, her hands as steady as ever. She took on a new commission that summer, her first in months. A wedding dress for a young bride 2 towns over, finished 2 days ahead of schedule. Denise made good on her quiet promise to herself too. She started speaking up more, small things at first, defending a young busboy from an impatient customer, standing behind a coworker who'd been blamed unfairly for a kitchen mistake. Nobody made a fuss about it. She didn't need them to. Arthur visited Maple Creek often after that, though never again in disguise. He and Josie would sit together in the corner booth some mornings, talking about her father, about nursing. They talked about the strange and winding path that had brought an old man and a young waitress together, all because of a $5 tip and an act of ordinary kindness. "You know," Josie told him one morning, refilling his coffee out of pure habit. She no longer worked there full-time, but some habits never quite left. "My dad used to say the measure of a person's isn't what they do when everyone's watching. It's what they do when no one is," Arthur finished, smiling. "I read that same lesson in your eyes, Josie, the very first morning I walked through that door. Outside the window, Main Street carried on the way it always had. Trucks pulling into the hardware store, farmers loading feed sacks. The same handful of familiar faces year after year. It was a town that had, in its own quiet way, learned something important. Something about the people too easily overlooked. The framed $5 bill hung above the register still, catching the morning light every time the bell above the door rang open. It welcomed whoever walked through it next, exactly the way Josie always had, without condition, without judgment, and without ever once asking what a person had in their wallet before deciding they were worth the kindness anyway. There is a lesson worth sitting with, long after a story like this one ends. Most of us will never know, in the moment, which small kindness might matter most. The stranger we help across a parking lot. The extra minute we spend listening to someone the rest of the world has stopped looking at. We rarely learn the full story behind the people we meet. We only get to choose how we treat them anyway. Daniel Merritt never knew his one act of courage would ripple forward 12 years. Into a hospital room, a courtroom, and a diner full of grateful neighbors. He simply did what felt right, in the moment it mattered most. He let the rest of the world sort out the consequences on its own time. Perhaps that is the only inheritance any of us can really leave behind. Not the size of a fortune, not a name on a building, just the quiet, steady proof that we were kind, especially when no one was keeping score.